The frustration, the rage, despair, all on display in yet another massive anti-government protest today. But the blast is just the latest crisis to hit Lebanon. And just ahead, we're going to hear from longtime Middle East correspondent Robert Fisk about what he calls the endless tragedy that has befallen the Lebanese people. But this was the scene in Beirut this morning, cleanup after the latest outpouring of anger against the ruling elite. The explosion that rocked the city has intensified the demands for change, and today the international community came together in response to the catastrophe. The French President Emmanuel Macron led a virtual summit of world leaders. Macron is calling for immediate action and an independent investigation into the cause of the explosion. We get the latest from the CBC's Philippe Leblanc, who is in Beirut.
It's quite empty at Martyrs Square, where the protesters were gathering today. Basically, we're seeing some people trying to offer any help they can in the shape of cleaning up after the violence that we saw between protesters and the police forces yesterday. We see some people that are trying to offer the help also in the reconstruction, rebuilding of the neighborhood not too far that was devastated by the port. I have with me Mira Abdallah. She was in the protests yesterday. You were not too far from here. What did you make of the protest yesterday? Because we've seen many of such protests since October. How different was it?
Yesterday's protest was just an expression of anger, especially after what's been going on. And before the explosion, we've been living in a very severe financial crisis, and then the explosion happened, and then how the government was reacting to the explosion was like it does not actually reflect the density and the amount of the explosion that happened. And then after this, we didn't see any resignations, not for the very first 4 days after the explosion. Our president actually thought this was a chance to rebuild. So killing nearly 160 people who were dead, our president saw it as a chance to rebuild. So this made the people very angry. And then in addition, we've heard a lot of news that aid that is not getting to our government is actually being stopped. For example, the Canadian diaspora in Canada, they actually told us that the flights that were carrying donations to Lebanon, they were not supposed to go to the government. The flights were being cancelled. So all this anger resulted in yesterday's protest, because we just don't want this to repeat again. We don't want these politicians who are in power now to keep killing us.
Very quickly, Mira, 6 members of parliament, 1 minister have resigned since yesterday. What do you make of it? Is it serious or is it too late for you?
Well, it is serious, but unfortunately not the main political parties who are resigning. So even if these MPs are resigning, and we had one minister, the Minister of Information, who resigned today, but the MPs who are resigning are not the main political parties and the main political blocs in the parliament. So the people who are in power are still in the power, even with the resignation of these 6 MPs.
Thank you very much. So the big question right now is, are there going to be more protests today? There's no official call for more protests like there was yesterday, but things can happen very spontaneously, so we'll keep an eye on it today.
And our thanks there to our own Philippe Leblanc, who is once again in Beirut. Now, in the wake of this tragedy and the rise of protests, will this actually be a turning point for Lebanon? To talk about this, we're now joined by veteran Middle East correspondent who has spent many years in Beirut, Robert Fisk. He is in Dublin, Ireland this morning. So, Robert, thank you for joining us today.
You're very welcome.
So here we are witnessing ongoing protests in Beirut, and we have, as you heard there from Philippe, and I'm sure you know yourself, a government minister, the Minister of Information, resigning over the public anger. What's your reaction to that?
It doesn't mean very much. Manal Samad, the minister you're talking about, I was talking to a source very close to her, shall we say, this morning, and was made aware that several times in the past week she's brought up serious questions about the bankruptcy, the corruption in the government and so on. On each occasion when she's done this at cabinet, she's been effectively ignored. So her resignation is probably a very good idea from her point of view and probably to be expected. But, you know, as your colleague said just now and implied, the government still wants to try and cling on because the government is effectively controlling, or is part of, all these various power groups, political parties, be they Shiite, Sunni, Druze, Christian Maronite, which is split in two, including the Hezbollah among the Shiites. So the problem is that once you have a corrupt government, it's a bit like cancer. It's very difficult to get rid of it because you've got to deal with it. And the moment you touch it, and this is Macron's point, you start giving it money.
Well, interestingly, you did write for The Independent, and in the article you begin it by saying the following, and we put it on a board for people at home. Take a look. You write, "There are moments in a nation's history which are frozen forever. They may not be the worst catastrophes that have overwhelmed its people, nor the most political, but they capture a society's endless tragedy." How did Tuesday's explosion do that?
I think because it comes at a particular point in Lebanese history when so many people in Lebanon are suffering massive unemployment, massive collapse economically. You know, the Lebanese pound has fallen 80% since October. People's savings have dribbled away. The middle classes are being hit. And one other thing is that, you know, Lebanon was really created by the French, by Macron's country, for the Christians of Lebanon. And it's the Christians who've largely been devastated by this explosion. It really hit more than anywhere else the Christian districts of Beirut. And so you find that at this critical moment, suddenly we're confronted, all the world is, with these extraordinary images of these explosions and this almost atomic cloud. I said, you're correct in the quotation from The Independent, I said it's a bit like Pompeii. Pompeii was not Rome, but it caught the corruption and self-confidence of the Roman Empire at a very critical moment. And we can go and look at it now. And in a way, that devastation symbolizes what many people feel that their country has become for them, a devastated society. That, I think, is what lies behind this explosion in terms of our symbolism and our feelings about it.
So let's go back then to what you said earlier, this idea that here we have one government minister, she has resigned, but as you say, she was what seemed to be the lone critic in cabinet. Nobody was really listening to her concerns about corruption.
There is another one. He's the environment minister, but he's not gone yet. But he probably will go soon. Yeah.
But for the others, you say they are clinging on, trying to cling on to power. Given that this is the moment that you describe, can that government actually hold on to power?
Well, you see, this is the big question. There is no leader of this revolution against the government. There never has been. There wasn't a leader of the revolution really against Mubarak in Egypt. There was no single revolutionary leader against Assad in Syria, and those revolutions didn't work, remember. When you have a group of people, however different by sect or by religion, who are in power and they have their claws in that power, it's very difficult to knock them off the perch just by having tens of thousands of angry Lebanese. The difference here is that I understand that some of those people in the crowds are in fact mourning their lost loved ones, and they are very angry indeed. I was talking to a government official in the last few hours who said to me there are people responsible for what happened, you know, the storage of the explosives in the port, who really should leave the country if they value their lives. But I don't see at the moment, you know, Lebanon, it's a cynical thing to say, is always going through the greatest crisis since the last greatest crisis. And this might be another of those. The real question is, how do you channel your money for aid for Lebanon without putting it through the government? And it's a very difficult thing to do, because the moment you say, well, we'll give our $20 million or $30 billion to this NGO or that NGO, you're in effect conspiring to try and overthrow the government of a sovereign state. And I don't think Macron intends to do that, especially since, as I say, it was his country which effectively created the state of Lebanon almost 100 years ago.
So what can be done then? Because as we said, Macron did lead that virtual summit of world leaders. Promises of aid have already been made. What can really be done by the international community to help in the long run? Because Canada has made a commitment to match the pledges that individual Canadians make to send that to, as you say, NGOs on the ground in Lebanon.
Yeah, the problem with this, you see, is that if you send something to a particular NGO, that NGO may also have a political argument, which is not exactly what the charitable institutions or governments want them to say. It may be that they get themselves linked with one or another group within Lebanon. The real problem is, you see, it needs a United Nations resolution to say the UN, under UN auspices, whatever they do about recognizing who's in power in the government, will organize the rebuilding of X or Y or Z, or the city of Beirut in this case. Can you have a UN resolution on that? Looking at the moment at the relationship, say, between the United States and Russia and the situation in Syria, I doubt it, but I think it needs a very big international movement. Obviously, I'm talking about the UN. The EU is really too small to actually come in here and say, look, we can rebuild this, but we're not putting our money in the government because we don't trust it, which is effectively what Macron was saying, isn't it? You've got to realize that when the president, who himself is a Christian, stands up and said there will be no international inquiry, it doesn't make you want to lend him $1 Canadian, does it?
Well, it's a very interesting conundrum that people are now considering. I will say that the Canadian government is partnering with the humanitarian coalition to try to raise money for people on the ground. But for now, I want to thank you for the time, Robert. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
And that's journalist Robert Fisk in Dublin, Ireland.